Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very accomplished professional and an author from Connecticut, USA, Mr. Eric Stone. Eric, welcome to the show.
It is great to be part of the brand called you. I'm excited.
Thank you. Eric is the founder and chief executive officer of Clear Path Ventures. He's an author, and all of you know I'm very partial to authors. He's an author of a book titled Jumpstart Your Workplace Culture, and you can see the book over Eric's left shoulder. He's also the recipient of the International Book Award for the Best Business Book in the general category. So, Eric, before we start discussions on your book, tell me a little bit about your own journey in brief.
You bet. So I was always fascinated with business. So my dad was a textile salesman
Mhm.
and my mom was a teacher. And I used to overhear them as a young little boy about all the business experiences my dad would have traveling. And I
Mm.
was hooked pretty early, from how my dad dressed in his suit to the conversations he'd have and the ebbs and
Right.
flows. Fast forwarded, I graduate college with a business degree and have no idea what I'm going to do except I want to be in business. And then I get really lucky. Unfortunately, the Boston Red Sox weren't hiring, so I couldn't go there. But
Okay.
but a company called at that time Enterprise Rent a Car, which turned into Enterprise Holdings and now Enterprise Mobility, was. And I had an opportunity to be originally one of four in an office.
Mm.
And from getting yelled at by customers to
Mhm.
learning all about the business aspects and leadership and mentorship, and slowly grew the company. Almost 30 years later, fast forward, I had an opportunity to lead a few hundred employees. And we were very fortunate to be considered one of the most successful regions within the company.
Mm.
And then after that, I felt I had something more to give. Hence, to your point of jumpstart your workplace culture, I felt there was something I had, a practical roadmap that might be able to help others.
Mm. Amazing. Amazing. Thank you. And that's quite an amazing journey. So let's now move straight to your book, Eric, and I'm sure that'll also cover a lot of your own journey. Your book, Jumpstart Your Workplace Culture. I'm going to ask all our viewers and listeners to go and check out Mr. Eric Stone's book on Amazon and other platforms that you normally shop at. So my first question to you, Eric, is what is your definition of a high performance work culture?
For me, it would be when these shared values and beliefs within an organization create a consistent behavior over an extended period of time that has a desirable outcome. And I
Right.
think if you package that all together, it's something special that you can put within an organization.
Hmm. Well said. And my understanding of culture is always the way we do things here. But my question is, what are some of the key elements of a successful workplace culture in today's corporate environment? And how has today's hybrid work culture impacted workplace culture?
So I like to say if when I work with organizations, there are five key factors that I think are really important and they're very simple, just not simplistic to get through an entire organization. The first, these organizations have strong relationships throughout their organization. So from the hiring process to the training process to the field presence of leadership,
Mm.
they create unique relationships that yield unique results.
Mm.
The other is clearly communicate their goals and expectations. They are laser focused on those 3 to 5 key priorities that the new hire to the person who's about to retire
Mm.
truly can embrace. Now, they'll have different levels of understanding,
Yeah.
but they really get it. The third would be right material and equipment, information in order for me to achieve the desired outcome that is expected of me. The training material throughout that journey.
Mm.
I think the fourth is really, really important, especially in today's environment, is encouraging personal and professional growth. Not
Mm.
just about key priorities within the organization, but what are those things I can do to be great at home? How do I unlock someone's potential inside and outside of the workplace?
Right.
And then the last would be an organization that encourages or recognizes and rewards top performance.
Mm.
They have the right number of awards, the right diversity of awards, and it becomes talk about a high performance culture. It becomes contagious when they recognize and reward it.
What a great
Now,
response.
In now, so what has changed in today? It certainly has become those principles follow whether you're remote, hybrid, or in person. There's five
Mm,
key things. It just might look different. The challenge, of course, with remote or hybrid is that social connection. Today I'm within my house and I'm within my confined walls. My communication might be altered a little bit, if not staying very close and being mindful to the organization. So it creates a few extra challenges. At the same time, it creates some flexibility. At the same time, it allows me to hire individuals all over the world instead of worrying about a commute in. So there's a variety of uniquenesses that I don't know if anyone's figured out just yet.
mm. Great response. And Eric, what are some common signs uh, that a company's culture needs a jump start?
Well, there's several. For me, I think a few things stand out.
Mm,
And this is after talking to thousands of people over my
absolutely.
time.
Yes.
And it is you hear this flavor of the week approach where these employees just never know what the right priority is. So
Mm,
this week it's going to be about market share, and next week it's about documentation, and the week after is only about customer experience. And there become so many initiatives, they keep changing technology potentially that no one can gain traction. No one believes in the thing that's going to happen because they think it's going to change next. It's very, very dangerous. You cannot gain momentum.
mm,
I think the other tends to be complexities.
mm,
I'll give you a real quick funny story is I was working with somebody on just a policy or procedure within an organization.
mm.
It was as simple as time off.
Right.
And I read this email 4 times about a new time off policy, and I still didn't understand it. And I'm just, well, if I can't understand it after reading it 4 times,
Mm,
what's going to happen throughout the organization? And as it goes through the organization, people get very gossipy at times. That's the one thing that ripples through. And then
mm,
they start complaining because it wasn't rolled out correctly. And
mm,
then you have the smoke signals. You have those things that really build up the mood and artifacts within an organization. And if you happen to have a lot of brick and mortar stores, you ever walk into a restaurant and you just feel it. You
mm,
just feel it's right or wrong. So those are some of the smoke signals. The other small thing, and it's not a small thing, but sometimes I was working with an organization that simple issues were not getting solved and getting to the leadership, and
mm,
they shouldn't have been.
mm.
Something was broken. Someone didn't feel empowered enough to solve the problem and felt it was okay. And those are just a few things.
Very interesting. Very interesting. And based on all the work you've done in this area, what role does leadership play in shaping and maintaining culture?
So for me, it was always, well, that's where it starts. So I don't think corporations have a problem listing their values. I think they have a problem at times living their values.
Mm,
And I think one of the things I know I was personally responsible for is looking at our company values and how do I truly represent them. So it starts with leadership, but
mm,
the key is the leadership designing what I call culture carriers throughout the organization who
mm,
are going to take that message, key voices, and continue to magnify, to continue to be the voice, the mouthpiece of the region to
mm,
assist in communicating some of those really important things. So it
mm,
always starts with leadership, but then it's got to have those culture carriers that continue to push.
mm. And to extend that discussion a little further, how does or what is the role of employees to be able to maintain and you know sustain an organizational culture,
Well, I think everyone has to focus within their 4 walls of where they work.
right?
And so I think it's significant. I think with leadership, with the culture carriers, as it trickles down to employee number 75,
Mm,
it's really important that they understand that they're a piece of that and they
mm,
believe that they're a big cog in the wheel of everything that goes on. And
mm.
so they have to really focus on their own 4 walls and how they represent themselves and how their values and beliefs turn into behaviors.
Yeah.
So I think they're an integral part, of course, as well.
I've often worked with leaders and a lot of their team members, and I've heard this comment, this is how it happens here. And I often say that, the moment you start to say something like this, there is something missing, because where is that spark? I'd love to get your perspective on what happens if there are legacy cultures in organizations.
Well, I think, I mean, the spark comes from the ability that everyone understands there's a
Mm.
huge piece to it.
Yeah.
And I'll give you an example. I used to meet with a variety of individuals that I call it was my think tank. It was the ability to bring others within that I could get their thoughts and perspective. And the biggest rule was you have to have polite disagreement with me. You cannot just say yes.
Mm.
You have to really challenge my perspective. And so well, culture is like a shock absorber.
Correct.
It worked better in bad times than in great. And so I
Mm.
always wanted to stay very close to those who had an opinion, who
Mm.
weren't afraid to share their perspective, who would say, Eric, we're missing it. Hey, that ranking is wrong. I don't
Mm.
like our promotional criteria. I
Mm.
think we need to recognize people for certain things differently. And you
Mm.
have to be the one who synthesizes this information, which creates this environment that I feel open, trust can be built.
Mm.
They know I'm going to listen, and they feel more open to voice, creating those sparks that are really important.
Mm. Well said. And, you know, I've often wondered, the large companies have certain kinds of cultures which you may want to change, you may want to continue or whatever. But today is the age of the startups, young founders, old founders, young companies. What should startup entrepreneurs do to be able to build a strong culture?
It's actually behind me, and you probably can't see. It's actually on this side. I would recommend,
Hourglass, yeah.
I use the hourglass. I
Yeah.
would use a simple approach, whether you're a startup or a seasoned company.
Mm.
And there's really five simple steps that you could follow. And,
Mm.
and, and it's called an hourglass for a reason. It's not an eyeglass that me and
Yeah.
you both have.
Mm.
It's hour together. And on the top, you have this discovery. So when you vision an hourglass, you're
Mm.
really pulling information from your customers, clients, stakeholders, employees to really, synthesize some information about what's going on, what is happening. And as it comes out, you're going to begin to orchestrate your vision, mission, values, all those things that are going to be really important, those priorities that we mentioned earlier on. And then you're going to gather commit as the hourglass comes out to synthesize. Right when the sand comes out, is that thing, is your priority of what you're going to be working on. Now, as you have that, and startups begin to build some momentum, more employees, you're going to go outward now. You now have to reinforce a lot of the things to become and build, go contagious and build traction.
Mm.
That could be building the infrastructure of what reviews look like. That could be what the training is going to look like to reiterate the message. And as the sand eventually hits, you have to assess whether it's a timeout or however you're measuring what
Right.
success might look like.
Right.
Now, each side of that hourglass, mission, vision, values on one side, policies, procedures, those should be your guiding forces. And that's a simple approach any business can
Mm.
use when you're trying to build something quite special.
Mm. What a wonderful response. Thank you. Um, you know, in today's day and age, Eric, given that we've all just come out of the pandemic and a lot of organizations have now started to accept remote working, hybrid working. When I was growing up as a young manager, there was always this culture of management by walking around on the floor or going with your cup of coffee into someone else's room. Uh, how can remote or hybrid work models impact workplace culture, and how can leaders adapt to this?
Yeah, it's such an important question. And what I like about when we introduce some of those factors is that those five factors can exist whether you're in person or you're remote, you're hybrid.
Mm.
I think you have to be extremely intentional. I think that's what we're learning.
Mm.
And so when I look back, similar to you, I would have been so much better if I could manage from afar utilizing technology. Meaning, if I had 50 brick and mortar stores, I can't get to them all at the same time. I
Mm.
have to have ways to check in, and I can check in very easy through Teams or Zoom or however it is. And
Mm.
it's the role of leadership to be very intentional, to stay very focused on your touch points.
Mm.
And so to me, you actually can spread the message even quicker,
Mm.
but you have to be very mindful of what happens for the individual on the other end because it
Mm.
can be a lonely business.
Correct.
And you do have to be very disciplined. We could all share stories of
Mm.
people we know who are taking advantage
Mm.
of some of those opportunities by working at home and working out
Yeah.
most of the day.
Mm.
But so I think there's that careful balance of using those five factors and
Mm.
being very intentional of how am I going to truly live those to make employees still feel trained
Mm.
and build relationships and trust and all of those things.
Fascinating. The other perspective I wanted to ask you was, that in most large organizations, there are probably three generations of people already working. The millennials, people who are in their 40s, 50s, and people who are, you know, boomers like me, who are maybe coming close to hanging up their gloves, so to speak. What strategies can be employed to ensure cultural alignment across
Yeah.
different generations of employees?
So that's a great question. And matter of fact, many think that there's actually five generations,
Okay.
believe it or not, where it starts with Gen Z, who is
Yeah.
really into the workplace. Then you have the millennials, the Xers, the boomers, and the silent generation,
Yeah.
those folks who probably started the company
Mhm.
and are still hanging around a
Yeah.
little bit.
Yeah.
So the biggest thing I recommend to align what you reference with all these generations within is
Mm.
step one, do generational perspective training. Everyone values different aspects of what's important to them at work.
Mm.
And what usually happens is perspective. You just don't always understand the younger generation at times.
Mm.
And so I would highly recommend that you do some sort of generational perspective training, all about worldviews and how individuals grew up. For example, Gen Z grows up in the technology era.
Mm.
It's the iPhone era. That's how they play on the phone versus me and you might have been running on the road in the street playing basketball or
Correct.
whatever, cricket or whatever it was.
Mm.
So, I would start with that a generational perspective training that allows people to truly understand. I think a lot of generations are misunderstood.
Mm. Well said. The other aspect of culture, which I've often wondered, and I'm glad I'm speaking to you, is you live in a country which is probably one of the most culturally diverse countries in the world. People from all over the world representing different value systems, etc. How can a company or how can a leader integrate diversity, equity, and inclusion into its workplace culture?
I think you have to start. One thing I learned from the hiring practices. So I can tell you, the first time I tried to do interviews, I was terrible. I didn't know what questions to ask. I had my own biases.
Mm.
You've probably heard of the halo and horn effect in an interview, where just
Mm.
because you say you love the Boston Celtics, I want to hire you. So step one is what sort of hiring practices do you have? How do you train through the interview process to make sure there are no unconscious biases?
Mm.
And then as that goes on in the training, so hiring, then you got the training and how do you train people on cross-cultural communications and
Mm.
things like that.
Mm.
So it's being very intentional. And then of course, having, whether it's an employee resource group, a reverse mentoring program, which can help from a generational perspective, ethnic perspective, where you might have someone high level within the organization to someone who is newer or from a different background. And it's actually reverse, where the younger person from a different background is actually coaching, guiding, and helping understand some of the challenges they face to someone who looks like me.
Mm. Well said. And how can storytelling be used as a tool to reinforce and spread company culture?
I'll give you a quick example of a story. So I was working with a company who is struggling with customer service. It's peak season, a lot going on, and they just couldn't figure it out. And we were able to find a video about Johnny the Bagger. I don't know if you've ever heard of the
I've heard
story, a
this.
young man who has Down syndrome,
Mm.
who was a bagger. He literally, through his thought of the day, transforms, I'll give you the fast version, the entire grocery store, so much so that his thought of the day creates a line three times as long as anybody, and everybody is amazed where other departments now all of a sudden the floral department sees what Johnny's doing and they create their own thing
Mm.
where the unused corsage or broken flower is pinned on a young adult elderly individual, transforms the whole story. So we took that video, we implemented that because that's a behavior. That was one of your first questions. What is this culture?
Yeah.
And it was this is the behavior we want to represent from one of our values about customer service. It goes into the new hire training. It goes into all of the training. And it was just a 2.5 minute video.
Yeah.
It goes into the review writing to say, you know what, Eric, how do you represent the Johnny the Bagger moment? It then goes into a weekly vote on customer service and who's truly representing these behaviors. And next thing you know, it is a story that can be told throughout an organization. Most importantly, the customers see that. And that is when the employee experience, the customer experience comes together and creates something special.
Amazing. Amazing. Thank you. That and Johnny the Bagger story is an amazing story. I think I've read it many times, and thank you for sharing the story with all my viewers and listeners. So, Eric, I have time for 2 more questions. Can you think of a company that has successfully transformed its workplace culture in the last few years?
You know, what would come to mind, and I'm sure there's many. What would come to mind for me is I remember watching a series on Netflix about Abercrombie and Fitch. And it was all about the toxicity of what was going on within that organization. And just by knowing a few people who are now part of that organization, and I've watched how they've changed from the hiring practices to their marketing campaigns to be much more inclusive, how they've really put their chips in on employee engagement, how they continue to give back within the communities that they serve. They would be one that really, I think, is trying to make a transformation throughout their organization.
Amazing. Well said. Well said. And my last question for you, in your view, what are some of the biggest trends in workplace culture that you see in the next few years, given the future of work that's happening as well?
I think one thing certainly is this digital transformation, this ability actually to get data, a large amount of data throughout whether it's the Twitter world, or I should say X world, or any social media platforms, and you can pull all this information and redirect messaging. And the ability to just synthesize a lot of information will also transform into policies and procedures that are simplified potentially. And so I think it's going to be a different world with that, but you cannot forget the timeless principles of leadership and organizational culture that do have to remain. But I think that ability with OpenAI to pull information and utilize it at real time is going to be quite unique in the world of organizational culture.
Well said. Eric, on that note, I just want to say thank you so much for speaking to me about your journey. Thank you for speaking to me about your book, Jumpstart Your Workplace Culture. I think the depth, we had a lot of points that we discussed on culture, the impact culture has on organizations, on people, on what we can do as leaders to be able to manage culture. You also covered in some detail about startups and how culture could benefit them. And of course, you gave me some amazing stories, Johnny the Bagger, or you also gave me a very interesting perspective of what to expect given all the technology that's coming in. Thank you for speaking to me, and good luck to you.
Thank you for having me as a guest. Loved it.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.